The Global Bird Weekend is taking place on the 7th to the 9th of October 2022. As in previous years, I'll be leading a virtual team of birders from around the world. And once again, we're raising funds to support BirdLife International and their work conserving the habitats that are so important to migrating birds. If you'd like to help us, please visit our JustGiving page. The link is in the show notes, but the short link is bit.ly/CBTeamOct22. If you're able to contribute financially, that would be wonderful, but it would be fabulous if you could share the link with all the people that follow you on social media, and that would spread the message as far as possible. Thank you. Welcome to the Casual Birder podcast. I'm Suzy Buttress. As a casual birder, I take pleasure in watching the wild birds around me, wherever I am. In my show, I share the joy of birding. I tell you about the birds I've seen, speak with experts and enthusiasts, go on bird outings, and I share stories from birders around the world. In case you missed it, last episode, wildlife photographer Boris Belchev told us about birding in Lithuania, a small Baltic country with over 400 species, including white-tailed eagle, aquatic warbler, and common rosefinch. It's another in my series of chats recorded at Global Bird Fair. Do take a listen. At the end of August, we spent a weekend down in Lymington, Hampshire, at a location near the coast. Wanting to improve our skill at identifying waders, we chose accommodation close to Keyhaven and Pennington Marshes, a nature reserve we had previously visited for the Global Big Day back in May. On the last day of the long weekend, we stopped off at Acres Down, a New Forest National Park near Lyndhurst in Hampshire, to see what non-wader species were around. While there, I sat down with my birding partner and husband, John, to review the weekend. The hiss you can hear during the recording was made by the wind rustling through beech trees nearby. We're in the New Forest, sitting on a bench partway up a hill, overlooking ferns and conifers and hills in the background, which might be Whitemoor, which will be on the way to the sea. We're at Acres Down in the New Forest, and we've just come here at the end of a lovely weekend, staying in Lymington, where we were on a quest. You could say we were on a wader quest. We're on a quest to try to identify as many waders as we could see at the coast. And we'll talk about that in a second, but first a little bit about Acres Down. We came here in May. We were spending time in the New Forest then for the Global Big Day, and it was a glorious day, and we had a wonderful time walking. We went to Pennington and Keyhaven Marshes, and we also spent time at a place called Pigbush Enclosure, which is a sort of area of heathland and woods, and Blashford Lakes. And on the following day, because we were still in the area, we thought we'd come out to a local nature reserve and spend some time here. And it had been glorious the day before. In fact, a bit too hot, but it had been really lovely. And when we got here on the next day, it was extremely wet. And we debated several times whether we should continue our walk or turn back. But after huddling under some trees and having a coffee, which could have been an everlasting cup of coffee with the rain, we decided to carry on. And we're really pleased that we did, because on that walk, just a little bit along from where we're sitting now, we saw meadow pipit up in a tree, woodcock or snipe fly over, we weren't quite sure what, saw some missel thrush being really active down amongst the ferns, and that took us a little bit of time to work out what they were, because they were much paler than we were expecting to see. Woodlark on the way up to that overlook, which was great because we'd only just really learned that species. And our biggest thrill of the day was a lesser spotted woodpecker, which was the first time John had ever seen one, and only the second time I'd ever seen one, and we had really good views of it. So we were able to absolutely identify it. So that was really good. So this weekend we've been down in the New Forest again, this time staying in Lymington, very close to the Pennington and Keyhaven Marshes. And in fact, from where we were staying was just a 10-minute walk. We're on our way home now, but we thought we'd stop off here at Acres Down again to see what delights might be here. Now, it's end of August. Although the first birds are starting to arrive on migration and others are starting to leave, So you're never quite sure what you might find. But unfortunately, it's been quite quiet today on our walk. It's quite a pleasant walk, the sun's out, so it's not as wet as it was last time we were here. And we've only seen really one little mixed flock of birds, which gave us goldcrest, chiffchaff, coaltit. Oh, we saw a tree creeper with them as well. Greater spotted woodpecker was in the area. And then other birds we've seen have been like wren and robin and a blackbird. But we were hoping that we might see a few more species, but, we're only halfway through our walk, so who knows what we'll find. But the main reason for having this chat now is to talk about the birds that we saw on the coast. And I've got John with me again to remind me of all the things. But also we had slightly different experiences. John is very good at getting up very early and going out very early. I'm not so good. I was usually about 45 minutes to an hour behind him. The state of the tides meant that if we got to a certain bench, we could sit there and watch the tide come in and then watch the waders come in with the tide. They would be feeding out on the flats, and then as the tide started coming in, the different size birds would either decide to fly off somewhere else to feed, or the medium-sized and larger birds would come closer to the shore. So we were able to get a good view of quite a lot of them. John, tell me about your experience of sitting on that point.
Yeah, it was just fantastic to arrive quite early in the morning with the tide quite a long way out. With your binoculars, you could look out and see lots of curlews, common ring plovers, turnstones, oyster catchers, lots and lots of waders, quite a long way out, but in the knowledge that the tide was starting to come in, and sitting on that bench that you mentioned with a flask of coffee and your binoculars pointing out to sea was just fantastic. As the tide rose, it pushed all the waders closer and closer into us, and we would get progressively better views. One of the highlights for me actually was seeing grey plover in summer plumage. I can't believe we've never ever seen grey plover in summer plumage before, but they started off being quite small specks in the distance, but as the tide brought them in closer and closer, we had lovely views of grey plover with the really striking black chest and tummy markings. So that was one of my real highlights.
As John was speaking then, I was just remembering we had a major fail this weekend. So we were down in Lymington for 4 days, 3 nights. John had to work on the first day, but I was able to go out walking and go and explore the area. And there were some sandwich terns, and I didn't know which terns they were. I was kind of down an embankment looking at a lagoon, and I could hear these terns. And so I quickly put Merlin Sound ID on them, and they said sandwich terns. So I thought, wow, I haven't had sandwich terns since Pagham Harbour last year, and that was the first time ever. So I rushed to the end and got up on the embankment so I could look out to sea. And they were quite a long way off, but I did manage to get a few photographs, very grainy, very blurry, but you could see in them that they were sandwich terns. So that was great. Anyway, during the rest of the weekend, when we were sitting on this seat looking out, they were very often on this spit of land, which was out across the water. You could just see white birds. Now, we knew that there were also black-headed gulls there, but you could hear the terns. Although black-headed gulls sound a bit tern-like, when you hear terns, you know it's terns. They're very sort of raucous. Too far away for our binoculars to really see. And I've got my zoom camera, and that was the only way I could identify them, by getting blurry photographs. When we were packing up to go home this morning, John pointed out that the scope was in the car. We'd brought our scope down for using to look out to sea, to bring birds closer. When we were unpacking, John said, I'll leave the scope in the car so we know where it is. It's an extra thing to take indoors, so we'll just leave it in the car. And that's where it sat all weekend. And we only remembered it this morning after we had finished all of our sea watching. What a major fail on a weekend where we had come down specifically to look for waders and see what we could identify. It would have been so useful to be able to look at the terns and look at the waders when they were that much further out, and to realise that we had the scope right at the last minute when we couldn't even use it was just, I couldn't stop laughing to myself.
To be fair, the sea did a very good job as the tide was coming in of bringing all the waders closer to us. It just didn't work with the terns. They stayed exactly where they were, which meant they were quite small dots in the distance.
But it would have also given us better views of things like the dunlin, the smaller birds which tended not to end up coming all the way to the area where we were sitting.
That is true. That is true. On the subject of Dunlin, I feel like from our trip to Shetland a few months ago, I've really learned the sound that Dunlin make. I think it's quite a surprising sound for those tiny waders. Quite trilly, but quite mechanical sounding. When I hear that sound now and look up, you see a Dunlin flying towards you typically. So that's fantastic. Another nice example of learning the sounds of the birds, making it that much easier to help spot them.
Yeah, I wouldn't have actually realised they were Dunlin that we were seeing, because they weren't in the plumage that we saw in Shetland where they had the black bellies.
I think some were, but yeah, most weren't.
And they had slightly brownish heads, more of a greyish body. But when I looked at their bill and their legs, which were both black, and the bill was definitely sort of Dunlin shape, just a little, probably about the same. Is it about the same length as the head?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Same length as the head, and plus their behaviour, looking like a little sewing machine, sort of pecking into the sand. So that was good, getting the Dunlin. New birds for this weekend.
We saw greenshank. That's the first for this year. I think they're quite surprising birds. I don't think I've ever seen so many redshank as we have this weekend out on the mudflats as the tide was coming in and pushing the birds towards us. And there were small numbers of greenshank among the redshank. They look slimmer, more elegant than the redshank, but have quite a strange way of feeding. They dart around a lot more. That doesn't seem to go with their sedate, elegant appearance. They seem to get quite excited when they see the morsels of food.
And talking about things that don't quite go with the elegant appearance, the little egrets.
Yeah, they have quite. I don't know. Well, how would you describe it?
Their voice is kind of like "Grawk," which isn't quite the same as the heron, which is more of a
maybe a slightly deeper "Grawk."
We've become quite used to hearing the sounds. But yeah, the little egrets, there are lots of them around, and they don't appear to enjoy being near to each other. So there would be a lot of chasing and wing flaring. But then it was quite interesting to watch them feeding. Some would pause for a long time before darting to catch something. And then others would be very actively, and talking about the greenshank made me think of this, very actively sort of darting around, looking, grab. And, there's something over there. I'll flap over there briefly and grab. And then all of a sudden it'll be a grok because another one flies in and there's a bit of tussle. So yeah, it was quite entertaining watching them. And we had such lovely weather. Like last night, we sat and watched the tide come in as the sun set. And with the pinks and oranges of the sky reflected in the water, and then you'd get the little egrets walking through pools of very still water reflected. It was just really beautiful to see them. They look very exotic because, of course, they are a bird that was native to Europe, southern Europe, and over the last 20 or 30 years have become more and more frequent here in the UK. But yeah, we've seen large numbers of them over this weekend. We did wonder if we might see great egret. There had apparently been some around, but we didn't. And there have in the past been cattle egret in that area, but again, we didn't see any. Another new bird for us this year, I'm not sure, did we see some up in Scotland?
What's that? Ruff. I think I may have seen one a couple of years ago in Yorkshire, but certainly new for this year was Ruff. Yeah, we were talking to that very nice couple of photographers who had mentioned that further along the coast, in one of the lagoons, we stood a good chance of seeing Ruff. And funnily enough, as we were just standing there chatting to them, looking at I think it was black-tailed godwits and redshank, we looked over and said, "Oh, is that a Ruff?" And sure enough, it was.
John's being quite modest there. I was talking to Maria and Ian, who were the photographers, and not really paying attention to the lagoon while John was doing all the scanning. And then he said, "I think that's a Ruff." And Ian had just shown us a picture of one that he'd taken previously further down the coast. And yes, as soon as John pointed it out and we looked at it, it was absolutely a Ruff. Much more delicate head than a redshank, and very scalloped, very beautiful scalloped feathers. I don't think they always have that scalloping. I think when we looked at the BTO video about Ruff, it was talking about them as they go through their plumage changes. They tend to get the sort of lighter edging on the feathers on the back, which make it look a bit sort of scale-like. Anyway, it's very pretty, but a small little elegant head, long legs. But yes, that was really good. And
we should also mention the northern wheatear.
Yes, we should. And once again, that was one that John spotted.
Because we received the eBird alerts for birds that are in Hampshire. Northern wheatear had been mentioned a few times in this area on the south coast near the New Forest. I really didn't expect to see one, but towards the end of the walk that we were on yesterday, we did look across this dry scrubby area and sure enough saw a northern wheatear, again a bird that we'd seen probably almost every day when we were in Shetland earlier in the year, so had become very familiar with it then, but we've never ever seen one in Hampshire before, so that was fantastic to see. Then a second one, so saw two northern wheatears.
Yeah, and I just said that I wonder if they're on migration, coming through from the North Country and going south to Africa and just stopping over. And because we'd just seen the one, I was feeling a bit like, I hope it manages to hook up with another one, because it must be a bit lonely migrating on your own. And then we saw the second one, so I felt a lot better about it. But the other thing about seeing the northern wheatear was that we were scanning, or John was looking and actually found it. And what he said was he'd seen something move and he knew there were some pied wagtails there and was going to just dismiss this other movement as pied wagtail, but just thought he'd look through the binoculars at it anyway, and discovered the northern wheatear. So it just shows you that sometimes being in a habitat, you can expect certain birds, but you never know what else might come through. And so you do get sometimes a little bit blasé about, oh yeah, that's such and such. And I've done it myself this holiday, walking along the seafront and seeing some house sparrows, and then seeing another little brown bird a little further up and thinking, oh yeah, that's a house sparrow as well. But actually when I looked, it was I think a female reed bunting. Oh, but I did it again when we saw the linnet, the young linnet, which had a very sort of similar look to a female house sparrow, unless you looked at it through the binoculars and you saw the streaky chest and, could work out that that was a linnet. So that's twice actually. I definitely did it with the reed bunting, and it could quite easily have happened with the linnet if we hadn't learned from our behaviours this weekend to actually look at things rather than just assume. And another time that kind of came into play was we'd been seeing some swallows over there's a little sailing lagoon that we came into the reserve by, and there were some swallows flying over that. And then I saw some martin type birds, and my first thought was it might be house martins because I could see they had white underbellies, but they were so fast because these had all been against the sky. And then I saw a few much lower down and I was seeing the backs, and I could see that they were brown like sand martins. And as I looked more carefully, I could see that they had a brown collar, white face and white underbelly, so we could see that they were sand martins. And last night there were loads and loads of them flying along the seaweed. There must have been loads of flies, so it was ideal for them to feed along there. And I guess they're building up their reserves before crossing the channel and heading south. Yesterday, as we were finishing our walk, just after we'd seen the wheatear, and then we were just looking around, and I was thinking, we just haven't seen any raptors. We've not seen any buzzards or kestrels or maybe hobbies. No, nothing around at all. And that was over the 3 days. I think I heard a buzzard once, but didn't see it. And we've not seen anything else. It's been gorgeous weather, great thermals. There's obviously food around for them. Where are they all? Anyway, I suddenly saw a flock of goldfinches take off. I was just busy counting them, saying, oh, look, all those goldfinches. There's 11 of them. And as I did, I realised there was a kestrel in the area, and that's what had sort of flushed them from the tree. So that was the first raptor we saw, and in fact I think it was the only raptor that we saw. But interestingly, there were some barn swallows flying around, and one of them started mobbing or trying to mob the kestrel, really trying to see it off from the area. And then a carrion crow joined in, so there was a carrion crow and a barn swallow chasing the kestrel out of the area. So it wasn't a good day for the kestrel. This episode is brought to you by Casual Birder Weekly, the show's newsletter. Each edition brings updates and videos about the birds I've seen, tips to help you get the best birding experiences, and I let you know about any planned group birdwatch events straight to your inbox. Sign up now. The link is in the episode notes. I remember last night when the tide was coming in and you were seeing all those different species. I mean, there was oyster catcher, the redshank, little egret, dunlin, turnstones, greenshank, common ring plover. John, all he kept saying was, "This is fantastic."
Yeah, honestly, just getting your binoculars on the expanses of the mudflats as the tide was coming in. The mudflats were just alive with waders. It was just a really spectacular sight. I honestly don't think I've ever seen anything like it in the UK before. It's tremendous.
And I know that there are some areas in the UK where they have thousands and thousands of waders. This wasn't as intense as that, but it was still a massive variety and a lot of birds. I'm starting to come round to waders, I have to say. But again, they very often do sort of hang around a long way away. So, it's not as easy to see what you're seeing. You can get an idea from size and shape, but when it gets to the smaller ones, if they're that far off, yes, you might be able to work out what they're doing with binoculars, but you can't always see detail of their plumage. So it tends to be not as rewarding. But yeah, watching them last night and knowing that they were going to be coming towards us anyway, was really, really great. And I took loads of video because at some point I'll be putting all this on YouTube because I think it's really interesting to just watch their behaviours, watch what they're doing and understand that they've each got their own little niche there. They all feed for different things and they just get on with it. Apart from the little egrets that have a bit of a go at each other, most of them are just in their own space feeding as their species feed. And then the smaller birds tend to, if one takes off, they'll all take off and have a little fly around somewhere else. The bigger birds, like the curlew, the egrets, and the greenshanks, I think, as well, because they can cope with slightly deeper water. They tend to be around still when the tide starts coming in, and then they're not necessarily all sort of buzzing around together like the ringed plovers might be. And oyster catchers. We had oyster catchers there as well, didn't we? And some lapwings on the lagoons. And we'd see lapwing close into shore amongst the seaweed, but they didn't appear to be further out where the others were feeding at the edge of the tide.
One of the things that occurs to me, I think waders can be quite scary for beginners to become familiar with them. So sometimes you despair with things like telling apart a bar-tailed godwit and a black-tailed godwit, for example. And certainly if you see them side by side, they can look extremely similar. But as you become more familiar with them and you learn that, for example, if you just wait till they stretch their wings or they take flight, then it becomes really, really easy to separate them. So black-tailed godwits, for example, have the white in their wings, which bar-tailed godwits don't. And as I say, when you first start looking at lots of waders at the coast, it's very intimidating trying to tell them apart. But the more you do it, the more you become familiar with those little tricks, like just waiting for them to take flight, and then you see certain patterns in the wings, or white down the back, like we saw for the greenshank, for example. So don't be put off.
And I had another fail. On Friday, which is my first day down, I was really intently trying to look at the birds and work out what I was seeing. And I had convinced myself that the redshanks I was seeing were actually bar-tailed godwits. First of all, I didn't think about the fact that godwits have much longer bills than redshank. I just saw the redshank seem to have a brownish bill with a pinkish base, and I was remembering that godwits have that, but godwits actually have a longer pink area before it goes to brown, and redshanks, their bill is much shorter, plus that godwits are a bigger bird, but when you only see the one bird, it's hard to gauge size. And what I hadn't realised was that redshanks have a really lovely barring on their tail. So when I was seeing this barred area on these birds, I was like, absolutely, bar-tailed godwit. I can see it's a bar-tailed godwit. Also, some of the ones I was looking at didn't have very red legs. So of course, if they'd had very red legs, I would have thought redshank, but the legs weren't that red. So I was quite fooled, and I stood for a long time with this really nice guy called John, who's not my husband, who's also a really nice guy, but this was an older guy that I got chatting to. And I was going through all the different books and apps trying to work out. And of course, I kept thinking godwit. And then I was looking at other waders, but I didn't think redshank because it didn't really have red legs. And then eventually we realised, no, absolutely it's redshank. It had other features, and like a ring round the eye, and its behaviour, the way it was feeding. It was about the size, or just a bit smaller than the lapwing that it was near, and a godwit would have been bigger. Once I realised it was probably a redshank, I started looking around and seeing all the other redshanks, and the ones that actually did have red legs, I could see that the plumage was extremely similar to the one that I was trying to identify. So I'd just been misidentifying. The next day I saw some black-tailed godwits. We never did see any bar-tailed ones. And it reminded me straight away what a godwit looks like and how long the bill is and how tall they are. It's just been a really educational weekend, just spending the time each morning and evening, watching the tide come in, watching the birds approach. We spent some time looking at the birds on the lagoon as well during the middle of the day. You could see them reasonably well. This isn't the best time of year, especially if you're trying to work them out through plumage, because some birds are in their eclipse plumage or going through a molt. Their breeding plumage is the thing that really shows them off, and not seeing that. But the godwits, the black-tailed godwits, some of them still had their peachy colours, didn't they? So that was quite pretty. And the other thing about ID, today, just before we left, we saw 3 ducks flying around. And I couldn't work out what they could be. They had big, large white wing patches. And luckily, we were talking to a guy called Dale, who's a bird photographer. And he quickly snapped off, well, no, he didn't. He took some proper photographs. I snapped some photos. Mine were all blurred and you couldn't really see what they were. But he let me take a photograph off the back of his camera. And I could see, although we couldn't see the white patch, we had absolutely noticed that white patch in flight. I could see that the bird had a grey bill with a black tip. And I felt like I knew that, but I could not think what duck had that. And it also had a sort of pointed tail in flight. Anyway, I put it through Merlin, the Merlin Photo ID this time, and it came up with 3 options. I can't remember what the other 2 were, but one of them was widgeon. So I read about widgeon on Collins' Bird Guide, and yes, they are noted for having big white wing patches. So thank you to Dale for showing me that photograph, and now I've learned a new bird. But yeah, had a wonderful weekend, spoke to some really nice people, and learned a bit more about the waders. And I'm looking forward to taking a BTO wader course over the next 2 weeks, and hopefully building up my experience, ready for the Global Bird Weekend, which incorporates the October Big Day. And we will be on the Isle of Wight for that, so I will be looking to incorporate my knowledge of waders for that weekend. After recording this, we continued our walk back down to the car park, and spent about half an hour craning our necks to look up into the tree canopy as we encountered another mixed flock. This one including spotted flycatcher, goldcrest and coal tits. While listening to the calls of the flock, we activated the Sound ID section of the Merlin app. It told us there were firecrest around, which we would dearly love to see, but we had no luck. Possibly the calling goldcrests created confusion. Over that weekend, we saw 70 species and made 23 checklists. Birds added to my species seen in 2022 list were sandwich tern, common greenshank, ruff and common crossbill. I mentioned in the review that I was going to take a BTO course on wader identification, which I've now completed. BTO is the British Trust for Ornithology. It was held over 2 Tuesdays on Zoom and was excellent. The trainers, Ben and Steve from BTO Scotland, were obviously expert birders, but their training style was extremely supportive. The first session focused on learning 3 species, dunlin, redshank and curlew, and using those as a reference point to compare with other similar birds. By initially focusing on structure, the size of the bird or the length of the bill in relation to the head, for example, before looking at plumage, it helped me to finally start to feel less bewildered by this large group of birds. The following week's session focused on common green and wood sandpipers and compared the reference species redshank and dunlin with ruff, sanderling and knot. There was also a very interesting section on the changes that feathers go through as they age over a season, and how that affects our overall view of a wader's plumage. If you are at all bewildered by the thought of identifying waders, do look out for future sessions. I highly recommend the course. You can sign up for their e-newsletter to be notified of similar courses in the future. The link is in the show notes. I learned so much, to the point that I was actually excited to go out and actively look for wading birds on my next few birding trips. So, over the last few weekends, we visited more coastal sites in Hampshire, Farlington Marshes, Hook with Warsash and Titchfield Haven. Each of those days has provided challenges and successes, but I was able to confidently identify spotted redshank, curlew sandpiper, glossy ibis and little stint, and all of those were lifer birds. Getting out at this time of year has also brought an additional lifer, windchat, and more first-of-year sightings with cattle egret and bearded tip. My year list now stands at 174, which is 8 more species than we saw last year. Having checked the British list, published by the British Ornithologists' Union, the official list of wild bird species recorded in Great Britain, I realised my previously recorded Muscovy duck was not a valid wild bird record, so I've removed that sighting, as it was likely part of a wildfowl collection. Looking at the British list also confirmed for me that I was right to remove my sighting of the black swan we saw at Blashford Lakes a few weeks back. It's exciting to think that we might edge closer to 200 bird species seen in this year, but it's more of a fun challenge to ourselves than a desperate race around Britain to add species to reach that total. There are some birds that continue to elude us, such as the firecrest, which has been recorded recently in some of the places we generally visit, so I live in hope. You know how much I love to hear about the birds you're seeing. You can contact me on my website at casualbirder.com and go to the contact page, where you can leave a voice or a written message. Natasha from Shetland, who featured in episode 113, sent me this voice message.
I'm sitting on a beach on a remarkably quiet Shetland evening and pondering about how I use Merlin. The truth of the matter is that in Shetland, I use it very little. Couple of reasons for that. One is that actually a lot of the time there's the background noise of the wind, which just makes it hard to pick up the bird sounds. And the other is that I'm pretty familiar with the calls of all our local birds. So while I use it from time to time, I don't find it makes such a difference. When I find it's really useful is when I go south to the mainland. So I used it a lot on both of my trips this year, the first in southern Scotland mainly and the other in southwest England. And the cast of birds there is so different, particularly so many passerines, whereas I'm much more used to things like waders here and other seabirds. It makes so much more difference being able to identify birds by song and by call. And a couple of years ago, when I first started getting into birding by ear, I managed to get, comfortable reasonably quickly with some of the songs of the songbirds. But I really didn't get very far in terms of digging into the calls. And actually, when we get the migrant birds up here, they're generally not singing. So calls are useful in a way that, the song is very much more limited to the breeding season generally. So both of those trips I've found Merlin extremely useful. And just to get my ear back in, to sort of listen around me and at the same time have Merlin running and see what Merlin thinks is around me makes me tune in much better. I start to look and see if I can see what Merlin says is there. I think learning how important earbirding was opened things up for me hugely a couple of years ago, and Merlin seems to be that next step there. I'm going up to Mallorca next month. So again, there's going to be lots of birds that are unfamiliar to me and birds with unfamiliar calls. So I'm really looking forward to using Merlin there and seeing how much it can help me out. I think the other difference up in Shetland is that often you can see birds quite clearly. We don't have a lot of tree cover, so even if we have migrating passerines, often you get a reasonably good view of them because they're not deep into trees and heavy leaf growth. Whereas down on the mainland, often you're hearing things, but trying to actually catch sight of them is really hard, and maybe they're at the top of the tree which is backlit, so you don't get a good view anyway. So times like that I find just really using my ears and using Merlin to just boost that ability almost is super helpful. I first used the Merlin Sound ID seriously in May when I was visiting Scotland, and my parents came up and met me and we spent half a day together, and I showed it to my mum, And I thought she might find it quite interesting, but I was really delighted when I went back south again a couple months later and we were sat in their garden having our dinner. And my mum, I kept noticing her with a phone out, holding it up in the air in that kind of distinctive, my phone is listening for birds pose. And it was so exciting. She was telling me all these birds they'd had in the garden that she'd simply not been aware of before. But Merlin had pointed out to her that these birds were there. So it's been, just a real pleasure to see how much joy that's brought to her as well.
Thank you, Natasha. That was a really good description of how Merlin's Sound ID can help you with your birding, and how lovely to hear about the enjoyment your mum has received by using the Merlin app to supplement her birding. I'm introducing a new section of shout-outs to those people I meet when I'm out birding, all of whom have been really lovely. Whenever I go birding, I'm always happy to stop and talk to others, answering questions about what I'm looking at, and hearing from others what birds they've seen. These last few weeks I've been wearing t-shirts and a hat branded with my show's artwork when I'm out, so that I can easily mention my show, and so that I can be recognised if you see me. Thank you to everyone who's chatted and taken a business card. You didn't have to listen to the show, but if you have, hello, I'm giving you a shout-out. Back at Normandy Lagoon during our Lymington weekend, I met John, who was cycling past but stopped to ask what I was looking at when I was intently trying to identify that tricky redshank. And there was a gorgeous pair of lapwings close by as well. In the sunlight, their plumage was just beautiful greens and golds. We admired the birds together while trying also to identify that redshank, which had brownish rather than bright red shanks. Thank you, John, for helping me to finally identify it as a redshank after we looked both at my apps and in his Collins Field Guide that he had with him, and taking quite a while to discuss the bird's features. On the Saturday evening of that weekend, I went back out for sunset to have a wander around the lagoons, and get bitten by lots of mozzies. But I also met Suzy, Ian, Fran and Mark, who were on their way to go out to dinner. They asked me about the little egrets that had been flying off to roost. I explained about the different types of egrets and what field markings to look out for. When you see one on its own, they can look quite big, so you might be tempted to think it's a great egret. But little egrets have black bills and yellow feet, though if they've been wandering around in mud, you won't necessarily see that they've got yellow feet. And great egrets have yellow bills, and they're about the size of grey herons, or great blue herons if you're in America. I also recommended the Merlin Bird ID app, the Sound ID section in particular, which I found incredibly useful since I updated my phone, and now it works, whereas before it was just telling me house sparrow for everything that I listened to. On the Sunday at Normandy Lagoon, as mentioned previously, we got talking to photographers Maria and Ian. They gave us some great tips about places to go and see particular birds. Ian has a Facebook page, and if you want to check out his bird photos, look up Ian Hutchinson. On our last full day at Normandy Lagoon, just after we saw the northern wheatear, we were staring intently into the field for more movement, and a couple of women stopped and asked us what we were looking at. While I was describing to Alison what a northern wheatear looked like, a water rail started calling. So I was able to show her on the Collins Bird Guide app what it looked like, and pointed out how it sounded like a little piglet squealing. Alison was shortly going over to the Isle of Wight, where she was hoping to see the white-tailed eagles, amongst others. Again, I recommended the Merlin app, and went through with her how to identify a bird from the bird ID elements of saying what size a bird is, what colour it is, the location, and the Merlin app will give you a whole range of possibilities. It's such a useful app, and it's free. Just a few minutes after leaving Alison, I met Russ, Sarah and Evan. Evan is 8 years old and loves birds, and he's really good at identifying birds from their sounds. And he told me his favourite bird is a great grey owl. On the final morning in Lymington, John and I had just finished watching the birds as the tide came in, and we got chatting to Dale, who had wandered by with his camera and very large lens. He's a bird photographer on Instagram at Knowleman, that's Knowleman. He's got some fantastic bird photographs, and he specialises in birds in flight, which was very handy as he took those photos of the widgeon that flew over and which helped me identify them. And Dale is already a podcast listener, which is always a plus. At Farlington Marshes a few weeks ago, we met John and Karen, who stopped by as my birding partner John and I were frantically trying to confirm our sighting of our lifer windchat. I explained to them why I thought and hoped that it was a windchat and not a stonechat, and as John had the scope on it, we let them have a look through. Yes, we actually remembered to bring the scope out with us that time. Following that meeting, I found that John and Karen had kindly bought me a virtual coffee. Thank you so much for that. At Hook by Warsash, near Southampton, I saw my first ever glossy ibis. Well, 3 of them. I wrote a blog about our day, which you can find on my website, casualbirder.com. Just after we saw the glossy ibis, and another windchat, we met Julia and her mother, who gave us tips on birds and local sites to see them. Also, thanks to information from Julia's mother, we completed the circular walk she'd suggested. As we got back to our car, halfway through the day, we heard a flock of birds moving through the trees above us. Along with goldcrest and long-tailed tit, Merlin's sound ID suggested firecrest, which is one of those birds we would love to see. We looked and looked, but could only see a goldcrest. A group of 3 people, walking their dogs, stopped to ask us what we'd seen. They said to give them the shout-out as Debs, Mark and the boys. We tried to point out the goldcrest, but they're quite tiny and there was lots of foliage, so I showed them a blurry photo I'd taken instead. And I told them about the Merlin app and showed them how they could identify birds with it. Back on the beach after lunch, I was filming the glossy ibis, and a young lad came up and started talking to us. He was out with his mum and younger brother watching the birds. He clearly knew lots about birds in general and was telling us all sorts of bird facts. I spoke with his mum Joy, and she told us that Rufus is 8 years old and a member of the Hampshire Ornithological Club, and he recently gave a talk with other young members that was watched by well-known naturalist Chris Packham. Although he's a youngster, he clearly has a passion for birding, which was wonderful to see, and I look forward to hearing about him in the future as one of our top birders. Last weekend, we went back to Titchfield Haven on 2 consecutive days. On the first day, birds of note were water rail and bearded tit, thanks to the 2 photographers who pointed them out to us, and a lifer little stint. On the way into the western part of the reserve, I spoke to Bridget, who told me how she often visits the reserve and enjoys sitting in one place, listening to and watching birds, which fills her with calm, something that resonates with me. I then met Darren and Frances, who were celebrating their anniversary. Happy anniversary again, and are just starting to learn about birds. Later in the hide, I invited them to look through our scope at the little stint and explained how we had confirmed our identification through size, being slightly smaller than the nearby dunlin, and with the 2 pale lines running down its back. Later in the afternoon, I met Tennessee and Cameron, who hoped to visit Costa Rica one day for the amazing bird life there. Cameron was photographing the birds, and I pointed out the area where I had briefly seen a water rail bathing, which had been quite a sight for me, but only a few seconds long, unfortunately. Following a tip from the warden, Doug, we went to nearby Crofton Cemetery that evening in the hopes of seeing firecrest. We walked around the paths of the old cemetery, looking into the oak, holly and yew trees. I did see a spotted flycatcher and 2 missel thrushes noisily calling to each other, but no firecrest. A sign on one of the graves said that Samuel Pepys mentioned the churchyard in his diary in 1662, where he observed that the graves were sown with sage. I wonder what birds he would have seen there. I then spoke to Chrissy and Craig, who were walking their dogs Roman and Juno, and recommended the Merlin app to them when Chrissy mentioned hearing a call in her garden at night that she couldn't identify. Chrissy, do let me know what it was if you found out. As it was nearing dusk, John and I decided to return the next morning in the hopes of seeing the firecrest, which had been seen for several days previously. We still had no luck, but I did speak to Steve and Margaret, who asked me about the harness I was wearing that holds my binoculars, camera and bag. As always, I was happy to share information about my kit, and they told me about a white-tailed eagle experience they'd had recently. Following our unsuccessful visit to the cemetery, we returned to Titchfield Haven. On our way to the visitor centre, Andrew and Tracy called out to me. Andrew had been the very person who had recommended Titchfield Haven to me back in January, when I met him at Farlington Marshes. We spent a very pleasant morning with them, having coffee, then birding at a hide on the western part of the reserve. And later in the day we ran into Tina and Colin, who we'd met back in July at Titchfield Canal when we were watching a barn owl at its nest that had been pointed out to us. They asked us about a mystery bird they'd recently seen, which looked like a water rail or possibly a young moorhen, but which had a shorter bill than the water rail and spots on its back. In fact, they'd seen two birds together. The only bird I could come up with was the incredibly rare spotted crake. It seemed very unlikely this could be the bird, but who knows? There had been one seen recently at nearby Farlington Marshes. Well, that's a bit of a bumper list of shout-outs, but each person I met has a birding story to tell, and it's wonderful to realise when you're out that there are so many people around you taking joy in the natural world. I've given out my podcast details to those who are interested, and hopefully they'll take a listen. And if you do see me when I'm out and about, do come over and say hello. If you'd like to support the show's production, you can buy me a virtual coffee at ko-fi.com. You can find the links to Ko-fi in the episode notes. You can also support the show by speaking about it on social media or leaving a review. This goes a long way in encouraging others to try out the show. Please remember to tag me in any of your social media posts so that I can share them too. My thanks to Randy Braun for designing the artwork for the show. The theme music is Short Sleeve Shirt by the Drones. Thanks to them for letting me use it. Check out their website at dronesmusic.net. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll join me again for another episode of the Casual Birder podcast.